Okay, so I'll have this recorded to the computer. Okay, so as I was saying, we're going to be examining the Tudors first of all, and the Tudors were the name of the kings and queens of England at this time. In the photograph, in the portrait, all right, this is a portrait by a Dutch artist called Holbein, and the main figure seated on the throne is King Henry VIII. Now, King Henry VIII is not only the most famous Tudor monarch, but he's probably one of the most notorious monarchs in the history of England. He's well known for having 6 different wives, and he beheaded 2 of these wives. And yeah, the others died in tragic circumstances. And finally, he was survived by his last wife. He is also well known, Henry VIII, as being the person who took England away from the Catholic Church. Okay, so the Roman Catholic Church was a very powerful spiritual as well as political power at this time in Europe, right? So we're talking about 16th century Europe, principally the end of the 15th century, beginning of the 16th century, when Henry VIII was alive. And this, sorry, I just got a message there. I thought it might have been from, you can probably see it up on the screen, from that student who's late. So sorry for the interruption. So anyway, Henry was the person who was responsible for taking England away from the Catholic Church. So he set up his own church, and that church became known as the Anglican Church. So Anglican comes from an old word for English, right? So one of the tribes who started the English nation, if you like, they were Germanic tribes. So one of the most important one was called the Angles. Okay, and these came over from modern day Denmark. And then you had the Saxons coming over from modern day Germany. And they sort of took over the land when the Roman Empire fell. So that's where we get the name Anglican from, right? So it's just an alternative word for English. So the name of the church, or the faith that Henry VIII started when he separated from the Catholic Church in Rome, was called the Anglican Church. And that started a series of conflicts, both religious and political, with Ireland, which lasted down through the years and even to the present day. There is still division, particularly in the north of Ireland, between those who are Catholic, who are usually nationalists in their politics, and then those who are Protestant, who are usually loyalist in their politics. Now, what do I mean by nationalist and loyalist? Well, I might write these terms because they're probably quite important. So yeah, first of all, the Anglican Church. Okay, so that's the name of the church that Henry VIII started. And then you have 2 communities in Ireland. You have the nationalist community, and then you have the loyalist community. So the loyalists are loyal to the crown. Okay, so when I say the crown, I mean whoever the king or queen of England is at the time. So Queen Elizabeth II is the crown at the moment. You might have heard of the series on Netflix, The Crown. I haven't ever seen it, but I know that it's very popular and it's supposed to be very entertaining. So yeah, they're loyal to the crown. And these people are usually Protestants. So by Protestants, I mean that they're protesting against the Catholic Church, right? That's where the word originally came from. And there's 2 specific denominations. There's the Anglicans that I spoke about, and then there is the Presbyterians. Presbyterians, like that, right? So Presbyterians. Now, the Presbyterians are what in Britain and Ireland we call Calvinists. So Calvinists are kind of, it's, I suppose, a very kind of literalistic and a very kind of extreme version of Christianity. By literalistic, I mean that they take the text of the Bible to be, you know, completely true, every word of it. So, for example, you know, like in the Old Testament, there are lots of statements that I think in the modern world would shock us. I think the God of the Old Testament was very vengeful and very aggressive. So, you know, you can take those things, and if you think that these words are the words of God, then it means that anything that you do, you can justify by using these words. Okay, no problem at all, Maria Teresa. Feel free to switch off your camera. Remember, as I said, I'm recording the presentation now, so if you do miss anything because of the connection, don't worry, you'll be able to get back. And then the nationalist population in Ireland are usually Catholic. Okay, so Ibin, you're over in China. I don't know if you know the political situation on the island of Ireland, but Ireland is separated into two different countries. There's the Republic of Ireland, which represents the 26 counties of the west and south of Ireland. And then you have Northern Ireland, which is part of the United Kingdom, and that has 6 counties in total. Okay, so there's 32 counties altogether on the island. So 6 of them are part of the United Kingdom still. And even though there's 6, the population in those 6 counties is quite high. So approximately 1/3 of the population of the island reside in the United Kingdom, and then 2/3 in the Republic of Ireland. So even though it's only 6 counties out of the 32, it's, you know, 1/3 of the population. So it's a pretty significant number. Okay, so those religious divisions that were started during Henry VIII's reign, they still have an influence on politics in Ireland today. So this is a very significant time for Irish history. So let me explain the family history of the Tudors. So things started off right with Henry VIII. His name was Henry Tudor. Interestingly, the surname Tudor is a Welsh name, and one of Henry VII's parents was Welsh. He was descended from the old kings of Wales. So yeah, that's one interesting fact. And they did look a bit more Celtic than, you know, some of the kings and queens that came before. So you had the Yorkists and the Lancasters, who were the previous dynasties on the throne. And then they were both like from French ancestry. And then you had before that the Plantagenets, who were again from French ancestry, and the Plantagenets would have descended from the first modern king of Ireland or of England, or the modern king of the modern state, let's say, William I or William the Conqueror, who became the king of England in 1066. So as I was saying, he was followed by the Plantagenets. That was his dynasty, William the Conqueror. And then after that, you had 2 competing houses. they were the Lancasters and the Yorkists. And we will see in a second that there was kind of a civil war between these two groups that was known as the War of the Roses. And then the eventual winner of the War of the Roses, they basically, that the eventual winner was Henry VII, and he got married with somebody from the other house, and then their offspring included Henry VIII. So he kind of united the two old houses, the House of York and the House of Lancaster. And that family became known as the Tudors because that was Henry VII's surname. And then Henry VIII is the one that we were talking about, who's the notorious king, you know, who had 6 wives and who famously wanted to get divorced from his wife, Catherine of Aragon, who was a Spanish princess. And then Henry VIII had a few different children. So first of all, he had Mary I, who was his child by Catherine of Aragon. You can see Mary I down here. She was known as Bloody Mary, and she got that name because she was very cruel and she burnt a lot of people at the stake. There's just a message coming up there. Oh yeah, that's from Maria Teresa there. No problem, Tere. So yeah, Mary I, as I was saying, Mary I was a Catholic monarch. So, you know, Henry VIII had been Anglican, and then it went to Mary the First, and then she was Catholic. So she brought England back to Catholicism once again. But she died very young. And as I was saying, she had the name Bloody Mary. So Bloody Mary is a name that she got, which is kind of a bit ironic because, you know, she wasn't any more cruel or any more gruesome than any of the other kings of, or queens of England at the time. But anyway, she got that name because she was cruel and because she was executing people all the time. You might have heard of, there's a cocktail, first of all, believe it or not, called Bloody Mary, which is, I think it's vodka.
Yes.
So you might have come across that before. Tere, I heard you recognize that one, right? And I've had that cocktail myself before. And then there's another thing that's associated with Bloody Mary, right? This is something that sometimes you see in horror films. I know it was in a horror film that I saw recently called Paranormal Activity Part 3. So basically what you would do, this is a game that you play as children, right? I don't recommend it, but this is a game that I heard about when I was a child. So basically you go into a room with a mirror, and then you turn off all the lights in the room. And then you stare into the mirror and you say, Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary, 3 times into the mirror. Now, remember, the room is completely dark. And the legend is that Bloody Mary will appear on the mirror for you. So remember, this story used to give me nightmares when I was a child, but that's kind of where it came from. So she's known in history as Bloody Mary. And then, so Lady Jane Grey then was a first cousin of Mary I, and she was another contender for the throne. She never became the queen, however. Now, Elizabeth I was the issue of Henry's second marriage. So he got married to a person called Anne Boleyn, and their daughter, Henry, of course, was hoping for a son. That's why he was kind of getting divorced and getting remarried all of the time. But instead of having a son as Henry wanted, they had a daughter, Elizabeth I. Elizabeth I, though, turned out to be, when she did become queen eventually, she turned out to be an extremely intelligent ruler, extremely able ruler. and she had one of the longest reigns in the history of the monarchy in England. Henry did manage to get a son in his third marriage, and the product of that marriage was his son, Edward VI. But Edward VI, he was a very kind of sickly boy, and he died when he was very young. So he died when he was still a teenager, and he didn't really have much influence on the monarchy in England or the political situation. So anyway, the Tudors, right, they ruled England from 1485. That's when Henry VII won the War of the Roses. And during this period, there were 3 kings and 2 queens. Okay, so Henry VII, Henry VIII, Edward VI, and then Mary I and Elizabeth I. So the best known ones are Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. Okay, so this is a summary. So you had Henry VII in 1485, then Henry VIII from 1547 to 1509, then Edward briefly from 1547 to 1553. So Edward was the guy who died when he was a teenager. And then Lady Jane Grey. It's disputed whether she was actually ever queen, but if she was, then that would have been in the year 1553 when Edward died, because England didn't want to have a Catholic queen, so they tried to find an alternative, and the first cousin of Mary I, Lady Jane Grey, was a suitable person that could take the throne. But then Lady Jane Grey was executed and Mary I became the queen. You can see Mary I only lived for 5 years as well. So she had a very, very short reign. She was, as well as bringing England back to the Catholic Church, she married a Spanish prince, and it would have meant that Spain would have become increasingly involved in English politics. And anyway, there was a period when Mary thought that she was pregnant, because there was a bump in her stomach, and she had other sort of symptoms of early pregnancy. However, tragically for Mary, it turned out to be stomach cancer, and she died at a very young age. So she only was on the throne for 5 years. So you can see that Edward VI only 6 years, Mary I only 5 years, and then Elizabeth takes the throne after Mary I. Now remember, Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn, had been executed by Henry, but in spite of being the child of an executed ex-queen or ex-wife of Henry VIII, she still managed to survive, and she managed to become queen. And she, remember, there were 3 religions on these islands then as well as now. So you had the Calvinists, who are sometimes called the Puritans, and they were the people who went to the United States as well on the Mayflower. You might have heard that story around this time during the Tudor period. And as I was saying, this religious group are Calvinists. They're kind of a very extreme version of Christianity. They're kind of, sometimes we use the term evangelical to talk about the style of religion that they have. So you had that religion, right? Presbyterianism, as it was called in Britain and Ireland at the time. Then you had Anglicanism, which was kind of very much the middle of the road. It was more similar to Catholicism than it was to Presbyterianism. So it was Anglicanism was trying to keep everybody happy, really. And that's the religion that Elizabeth in particular put forward. So it was kind of a compromise religion, if you like. But it was much more similar to Catholicism than it was to Presbyterianism. So the Presbyterians became known as dissenters. The dissenters. So dissenters are people who deny something, right? So that's how the Presbyterians were called. And then the third religion was, of course, the Catholic Church. Now we're going to look at the differences in a bit more detail. Sorry, my slides skipped ahead for a second. Okay, so we'll just briefly look at the War of the Roses, right? I won't go into this in a lot of detail because it took place over hundreds of years. And suffice to say that sometimes there were kings or queens from the House of Lancaster on the throne. Sometimes there were kings and queens from the House of York on the throne. So these were two competing houses. They were both related to Edward III. Okay, so you can see that Edward III, he had two different sons. He had John of Gaunt was one son, and then Edward was another son. So you see that that's what happened right there. So it descended from kind of two sons. And then you had those two sons, they started two royal houses, and then they were occupying the throne at different times. Some of the monarchs during that time are more famous than others. You might have heard of the play by William Shakespeare called Richard III. So Richard III is this character here. Okay, and he was responsible for murdering two of his cousins, the princes in the tower. So anyway, suffice to say that at the end of all of this battle, Henry VII acceded to the throne. So he had an accession to the throne. Okay, so the throne, this word here, Throne, being the royal chair. So Henry Tudor's claim to the throne was tenuous. So by tenuous, I mean it wasn't particularly strong. Okay, and he was the great grandson of Edward III. Edward III had 6 sons altogether, all of whose descendants could make a claim to be the rightful heir. So this word heir, right, is the person who inherits the throne, or who inherits something in general. If you have a house and you die, your children will inherit that house. So they will be your heirs, okay? So some of them had a stronger link to Edward III than others. However, the death of Henry VI resulted in Henry Tudor becoming the lead of the Lancaster family, and he fled to France during the reign of Edward IV. Henry had attempted to join the revolt against Richard III in 1483, but this failed. Instead, he waited until 1485 and defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth. Now, there's a famous line from that play by William Shakespeare, where at the end of the battle scene, Richard III has been defeated, and he doesn't even have any horse to escape on. So he says, a horse, my kingdom for a horse. So that's a very famous line, and he was so desperate to get away that he would exchange his kingdom for a horse so that he could escape. But he doesn't escape, and he gets executed. So he married then, this is Henry VII, married Elizabeth of York. So you can see the two families are coming together. He was the daughter of Edward IV and his niece, Richard III. So that united the houses, and it ended the War of the Roses. The reason why it's called the War of the Roses, by the way, is that the two houses were represented by different colored roses. So one was represented by the red rose and the other was represented by the white rose. So if you know Manchester United Football Club, they wear red jerseys because they come from Lancaster. So that's why they wear red. the red road represents Lancaster. And then there's a team from York, right, another county in England, called Leeds United. They play in the Premier League as well, and they wear white shirts because York had the symbol of the White Rose. And that story of the War of the Roses as well inspired lots of books and plays, for not least, Game of Thrones, for example. So Henry VIII became the heir to the throne when his older brother Arthur died from an illness. It's significant actually that Henry VII called his first son the primogenitus, or the firstborn son, Arthur, because Arthur is a Celtic name. You might have heard of King Arthur and Merlin and the Knights of the Round Table. This was a Celtic legend coming from Wales and Ireland. He chose that name not by accident, but because he wanted to hark back to the old Celtic history. So it was almost like, a Celtic family, if you like, coming back to the throne instead of, all of the French related kings and queens who had come before. Right, so he was crowned King of England at a very young age, Henry VIII, at 18, after his father died suddenly. And then Edward VI was Henry's young son. He was only 10 when his father died. And because he was so young, there was a regency council that was set up to rule until he was an adult. So really, Edward VI, didn't have any power at all. Then Lady Jane Grey came on the scene. So when Edward VI became terminally ill, he and the council drew up a devise for the succession. So this devise for the succession was, what to do when Henry died. Just if he died without leaving an heir, then, what would happen next? And this was done to prevent Mary from becoming queen, because she was Catholic, of course, and the council as well was Protestant. So the last thing that they wanted was a return to Catholicism. He also passed over his sister Elizabeth, as he believed in primogeniture, right? So that's the rule of the firstborn, primogeniture, coming from Latin, coming from Genesis, and primo, primo is first, like prime or premiere film, or the Premier League. And he didn't think that women should be heirs to the throne. He also maybe was prejudiced against Elizabeth because, her mother had committed treason, according to his father. So Edward, with the support of Lord Dudley, who was on the council, settled on the granddaughter of Mary Tudor, who was Henry VIII's sister, right? She got married to the King of Scotland. And so Mary Jane Grey was his cousin once removed, okay? Yet why, when Edward VI opposed Elizabeth's claim to the throne, would he pass it to another woman? Well, the answer is he didn't at first. He actually left the throne to her male heirs, and failing that, the male heirs of her sisters. So Grey was young and recently married to Lord Dudley's son. So the hope had been that she would give birth to a male child who would become the heir in time. That didn't happen. So you can see how the accession played out. And you can see the details of what we were talking about earlier. Okay. However, as Edward VI approached death, he altered the wording of the document to make Lady Jane Grey his successor. You can see the actual change of the wording here. Okay, so it was kind of, this was his will, so it was kind of rubbed out and changed. And then he considered this as an exception to the rule of primogeniture, necessitated by the reality of his situation, not an example to be followed. Lady Jane Grey became queen at the age of 15 when Edward VI died, and she had the shortest reign of any monarch, just 9 days. Okay, then Mary the First, as we're saying, she was summoned to Edward the Sixth deathbed, but she was warned that it was a pretext to have her captured. And this would make it easier for Lady Jane Grey to accede to the throne. Mary fled to East Anglia, which is in the eastern part of southern England. After Edward's death, she wrote a letter to the Privy Council. Okay, so this is the advising body to the monarch, with orders to proclaim her as Edward's successor, as well as sending proclamations throughout the country announcing that she was queen. She had gathered a force together and went to Framlingham Castle in Suffolk, right in East Anglia, in the county of Suffolk. Meanwhile, the Privy Council realized that they were wrong to go along with Dudley. They declared Mary to be the true Queen of England, and Mary rode into London with her supporters and was crowned Queen Mary I. Yes, that's true. There is, yeah, I have watched that series as well. Ebin, thank you very much for that suggestion. The Tudors is very, very good series, actually very entertaining. I would recommend that to you, Maria Teresa, if you haven't seen it. The Tudors, it's excellent. So thanks for that suggestion, Ebin. And this did happen in one of the episodes as well. Yeah, you're welcome. So then what happened after that? So Dudley was executed immediately. However, plots to overthrow Mary in favor of a Protestant monarch, that was, they were going along. And one of these included Lady Jane Grey's brother, which resulted in the execution of Lady Jane Grey and her husband by Mary I. Elizabeth, her sister, was temporarily imprisoned in the Tower of London due to the plots in her name, but was eventually released. Mary I was the first undisputed Queen Regent, right? So ruler as opposed to wife of the king in England. So she was the first kind of legitimate queen with complete power. Her husband was given the title King of England and Ireland, but this was not independent of his marriage to Mary I. So if she died, then he would lose that title as well. So she was the de facto ruler of the country. Now, Elizabeth I, we're going to talk about next. So Mary I had no children with her husband. So it was Philip or Felipe, Philip of Spain, who was a prince of Spain. So while, who became king of Spain as well. So while Mary was unhappy about Elizabeth, who was Protestant, succeeding her, she did name her as heir to the throne in her last days. While her regency was shaky, with more than one plot to overthrow her, Elizabeth I reigned until her death, and she was the last of the Tudor monarchs. So then you had a family that was related to the Tudors called the Stuarts, who were the current kings of Scotland. They then became the kings of England and Scotland together with the, and that was followed by the Act of Union. So it ended up that King James VI of Scotland became King James I of England. So let's revise what we were saying about Christianity during this period. So Christianity was introduced into England by the Romans, of course, the Catholic Church, okay, during the, I would say, 3rd century, 4th century of the Common Era. There was a short period of insular Christianity after the Anglo-Saxons linked with the church in Rome during the period of 500 to 600. Then there were several schisms. So schism is, this word here is a word for a division between various forms of Christianity, right? It's a Greek word. So there are various divisions of the Catholic Church. The two main ones were the Great Schism of 1054 and the Protestant Reformation. So the Great Schism, if you're curious, of 1054 was the division between the Western Catholic Church and the Eastern Catholic Church, or what became known as the Orthodox Church. Okay, so this would be the main Christian denomination in places like Greece today. They're mostly Orthodox. Also in Russia, Russian Orthodox. So they split up. So the Western Catholicism and Eastern Catholicism broke up in 1054. And then you had the Protestant Reformation, which was another schism. And that happened in 1517 when Martin Luther, right, who was a German monk, he nailed 95 theses. So it should say theses there. And these theses were complaints against the Catholic Church in Western Europe, mostly against the Pope in Rome, who was the spiritual and political leader of the members of the Catholic Church. So he nailed these theses to the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg in Germany. And you can still go to see that church today. And this set in motion the Reformation across Europe and eventually arrived in England and in Ireland. So the English Reformation followed a different path to that of the Reformation movements in other European countries, as its inception lay in Henry VIII's need for a male heir rather than criticisms made by Martin Luther against the Catholic Church. So actually, Henry VIII was Catholic until his death, right, in his own personal faith. And also he was given a title by the Pope in Rome. He was given the title of Defender of the Faith. So I think it's the Defendor Fidei, or Defender of the Faith in Latin. So obviously he was a great supporter of the Pope at one point. Okay, so then you can see how, look, Christianity broke up here from its initial period under the Romans and the Council of Ephesus. And then you have the Great Schism, then the Crusades as well. And then you have the Reformation, and then you have the various Protestant churches, and then you have Roman Catholicism in the West, and then you have the other orthodoxies in the East. So, for example, Eastern Orthodoxy in Greece, Russian Orthodoxy in Russia, and then the Assyrian Church or the Coptic Church in Egypt, for example. So that's how they. Now, if you want to see the differences in the various Christian faiths in England and in Ireland during the Tudor period, here's a brief summary of it. I won't go through everything, but you can imagine that, Catholic churches, right, are very much, they're decorated with loads of pictures and, art and architecture and sculptures. They're extremely important in Catholicism. They're not used at all in Anglicanism, and they are certainly not used at all in the Presbyterian Church or Protestantism, as they have it here. You can read Protestantism here as Presbyterianism, although there are now other types of Protestantism in England. The authority of the Pope, of course, is affirmed in Catholicism. It's denied in the other two religions. The clergy is, the Pope, and then followed by the cardinals and bishops. Then you have the priests and monks, and it's very much a hierarchical system. You have a similar system in the Anglican Church. So you still have bishops and clergymen and archbishops and that. They don't have any monks, however. And then in the Protestant churches, each church is independent and is led by a pastor who is actually elected from the normal attendees to the church. Then there is no divorce in Catholicism. Divorce is permitted in cases of adultery or abandonment in Anglicanism. And then in the Protestant Church, divorce is permitted, and also marriage of the deacon. Then we will just look at holy days. So holy days in the Catholic Church: Christmas, Lent, Easter, Pentecost, Saints' feast days. So they have loads of holy days. In Anglicanism, it's just Christmas, Lent, Easter, and Saints' days. In Protestantism, Christmas, although at one point they didn't even celebrate Christmas. And Lent is a positive but not sacred tradition, and Easter. So it's basically kind of today it's Christmas and Easter, if you like. So it's very limited. So Mary, the mother of Jesus, is considered holy and maybe prayed to as an intercessor or an intermediary between humans and God. In Anglicanism, Mary is considered to be human, but not without sin, and she's honored. And then in the Presbyterian Church, Mary is seen to not have any kind of special attributes at all. She's considered to be just human. Okay, so if you go around Ireland and you see a statue of Mary, you know straight away that, that was erected by Catholics. And then religious law. So you had the catechism in Catholicism. So there were ecumenical creeds in Anglicanism, but mostly it's just, the teaching of church fathers and the Bible. And then in the Presbyterian Church or in Protestantism, it was the Bible alone. Right? So it was all about the Bible, all about the Word of God. And that is still the case for many Protestants in the United States. For example, we often talk about Middle America and the Bible Belt. And the Bible Belt is this area in the middle of the United States, which always votes Republican. And it's where, Trump had his main supporters. And, they're very, very kind of extreme about their Christian faith. For example, they deny the theory of evolution. They deny a lot of other established scientific facts, if you like. Okay, and then the presence of Christ in the Eucharist is accepted in Catholicism. And then in Presbyterianism, it's just symbolic, basically. And it's a mixture of both in the Anglican Church. In Catholicism, we have a lot of different saints. There are thousands of them, literally, and they're very special for people. In Anglicanism, there are some holy people, I suppose, although they're not really considered to be saints in the same way. And there are no saints in Protestantism, at least in Presbyterianism. Okay, so anyway, looking at the politics then, so monarch, right, is the word, just wait for the next slide to come up. So monarch is a Greek word from mono and arch. So arch is leader, like archetype, for example. Or let's say aristocracy. So arch is in that word as well. So monarch is mono, is one from Greek, and arch, leader, so one leader. So these are some of the terms that we had in this talk, right? And right, I am going to be moving away from the Tudors now for a second. We're going to be going and we're going to be talking specifically about Grania and Grace O'Malley. So just to revise some of the terms that we had. So the Privy Council, they were 13 to 20 officials that gave advice and implemented decisions of the monarch. They also drew up legislation and they could act as a court of law as well. Then the parliament was made up of 2 representatives from each county and borough, and some villages as well had the right to elect a member of parliament. And the House of Parliament, they did not have the ultimate power to create the law because the monarch could veto it. Then you have prerogative powers. These are a number of powers only the monarch had in, for example, declaring war and pardoning criminals. And they still have these powers today. Then the civil service is the law, finances, for example, tax collectors, also people like the police and judges and things like that. And then you had the sheriffs and commissions of peace, who were like the police of the day. Okay, so we will leave the Tudors there for a second, and we may come back to it a little bit later. And I'm going to return to Gráinne Mhaol. So we're going to get started with Gráinne, and then I think before we finish Gráinne, I think we might take a break for about 5 minutes so that we can get a cup of tea, and then we'll continue with the end of her story. Okay, so Grace O'Malley, or Gráinne Mhaol, as she is known as in Connacht. Now, in my Irish, right, I speak Munster Irish, so I will call her Gráinne Mhaol. And so this is her name in Irish. And you might have heard of this song, right? So it's a song by the name of Oro She de Walliam, right? So Maria Teresa, yeah. Now, I won't play it for you. You can go ahead and listen to it. You can copy this link. Maybe I can put that into the chat during the break, and you can have a listen to it. Yeah, it's a really nice song. We are going to look at the lyrics, though, of this song for a second. I recommend Sinead O'Connor's version of this song. Actually, sure, we might as well take a look at it for just a second. So let me go to this version. So Sinead O'Connor, Oro She de Walliam. Just have a quick listen to it just for a second, so maybe you'll recognize the song. It's got kind of an echo, so so I won't play it, but look, maybe I can just share the link with you there in the chat, and you can go ahead and listen to it during the break. Okay, so let me do that now. Okay, so guys, I might give you a chance to go and listen to it there for a couple of minutes. Listen to the song, and then I will put on the next slide, I will put the lyrics to the song. And the reason why I'm getting you to listen to this song is because of the mention of Gráinne Mhaol. All right, so you see there in the lyrics, right? Oh, Gráinne Mhaol ag teach part sáile, oig le garmha le mar parda, gelid hen ní Frank ná Spánig, is corig siad rúd gaulid. And you see the lyrics there translated. So just take a listen off the song. Sinead O'Connor's version is very nice. And then we will return in about 5 minutes to continue with the story of Grace O'Malley.